Pesticides had become a way of life in post-war America, and by 1955, the country was being treated with more than 600 million pounds a year. But in 1962, the chemical industry, the government, and agribusiness were accused of poisoning the environment in a book called Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson.
Can anyone believe it is possible to lay down such a barrage of poisons on the surface of the earth without making it unfit for all life? They should not be called insecticides, but biocides.
Rachel Carson painted a nightmare vision of the future. Silent Spring polarized the nation, and the ensuing controversy changed the course of history.
A great book has a flow to it, and it changes people's minds, it changes their outlook, and it has a long reach. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is still affecting our thinking and our policy making today. The essence of Rachel's message was that we had to come to terms with nature and work with it and not against it. In a complex modern society, of course, that was a very radical concept, but in the sense of a change in our thought, I think she was revolutionary.
Silent Spring was a terrifying expose, and its crusading author was quickly swept into the public eye.
The reporter continued, "No one in either county farm office who was talked to today had read the book, but all disapproved of it heartily."
Rachel Carson was no stranger to fame. In 1951, her book, The Sea Around Us, had won universal respect. It made the New York Times bestseller list for 86 straight weeks, a new record. Once or twice in a generation, wrote one reviewer, does the world get a physical scientist with literary genius. Miss Carson has written a classic. Her concern was not shared by many. One biologist remembers the direction that most of the country was taking.
Remember that we had been benefiting from about 50 years of gung-ho technological development. Right after World War II, for example, especially, we went into a binge in developing new technologies.
One of these was chemicals. It had spawned a giant industrial complex, and it gave us a bewildering variety of plastics, drugs, lubricants, fertilizers, and among the most important of all, pesticides. Poisonous chemicals that kill pests, such as blights and parasites or insects that destroy crops and carry disease. The most famous pesticide at the time was DDT. It had saved millions of lives in World War II by preventing the spread of disease. It was cheap, effective, and apparently safe.
It was a military secret during the war. It was smuggled in from Switzerland. It'd been sitting there for 50, 100 years, but nobody had ever tried it on insects. And they found that it was a very potent chemical for killing certain insects. I'm told that World War II was the first war in which more people were killed by enemy action than by diseases.
A terrible disease in warfare is typhus fever, and it has been said to have ended most wars because in the final stages of the war, troops developed typhus fever from body lice. But in World War II, DDT spraying killed the lice, and typhus fever was stopped.
The United States faced a different kind of plague, insects that annually ravaged its farms. Following the war, DDT and other pesticides were put to civilian use on a massive scale. They worked wonders and production exploded. Synthetic pesticides were like miracle drugs, or so almost everyone thought. But a storm was brewing.
In the world at large, this was the only country that began to say, hey, wait a minute, there might be something here that isn't quite as advertised. Some people were actually worried about it, and the Fish and Wildlife Service was one. And the center of activity at that time, in terms of the research being done, was Patuxent National Refuge in Maryland.
At Patuxent, near Carson's home, her colleagues had been investigating the impact of pesticides. As early as 1945, she had tried to get the Reader's Digest interested in an article about these tests.
Practically at my back door here in Maryland, an experiment of more than ordinary interest is going on. The experiments show what other effects DDT may have if applied to wide areas, whether it may upset the whole delicate balance of nature if unwisely used.
The magazine turned her down, but over the years, evidence was mounting that some pesticides were deadly to wildlife.
We found that some strange things were happening. For example, people came into us in the late 50s and said, you know, there aren't many eagles left around here, and they're not reproducing. And other people came in and said, well, it's the same thing with the falcons.
The chemists and the agriculturists knew that DDT killed insects. They didn't know why. They didn't ask why. It was enough that it killed insects. It seemed to be enough for them. They should have been more curious, but they were not. They were practical people, and they went to work.
From 1945 to 1955, annual pesticide use on farms went from 125 million pounds to over 600 million. Soon, government agencies began treating even the suburbs with DDT.
People thought it was a good thing because they got action in solving a problem as they conceived it. They were, for example, complaining about mosquitoes. And if the spray truck came down the street, they were told to just stay indoors for a few minutes and everything would be all right. So you had the government endorsing a product and you had the chemical industry pushing it very aggressively. There was a development program going on within the corporate system saying, well, if a little bit is good, a lot more is much better, isn't it?
Public health departments staged demonstrations to convince the public of DDT's effectiveness and safety. Enthusiasm for the chemical knew no bounds, and few were questioning the wisdom of such use. Public places and private backyards were being treated whether people liked it or not. In 1957, planes sprayed a Massachusetts bird sanctuary owned by Olga Huckins, a friend of Carson's. In fury and desperation, Huckins told her what had happened. The birds showed all the symptoms typical of DDT poisoning. Huckins knew that the planes would be back in spite of her protests. She asked Carson for help. Carson later remembered how the thought of a spring silent of birdsong had moved her to action.
It was your personal letter to me that started it all. In it, you told what had happened and begged me to find someone in Washington who could help. It was in the course of finding that someone that I realized I must write the book.
The ornithologist Robert Cushman Murphy of the American Museum of Natural History sued the USDA to prevent the use of DDT in controlling the gypsy moth on Long Island. He lost his case on technicalities, but obviously there was a lot of concern before Rachel Carson came along.
Carson studied the trial records and found that they were full of chilling evidence of the dangers of pesticides. She wrote her literary agent of the first inklings of a powerful idea.
Having finally struck pay dirt, I feel I should do an article. I'm sending along a somewhat haphazard memorandum, which does incorporate a few of the horrifying facts about what is happening through the mass application of insecticides.
She tried to get articles in things like the Reader's Digest or other leading magazines. Nobody would touch it. In the first place, they had advertisers to worry about, I suppose, and it was a disagreeable, controversial subject, and oh no.
Carson's dire warning was that by poisoning nature, people were ultimately poisoning each other and subverting what she considered a fundamental right to a healthy environment.
If the Bill of Rights contains no guarantee that a citizen shall be secure against lethal poisons distributed either by private individuals or by public officials, it is surely only because our forefathers could conceive of no such problem.
Pesticide certainly wasn't an obvious subject for a successful book. On the other hand, Rachel was dealing with a subject that we all felt was important.
Paul Brooks, editor-in-chief at Houghton Mifflin, had been in on the project from the beginning.
Now, I don't claim that we knew this book was going to have the impact it did, but it was obviously something in the tradition of Houghton Mifflin publishing by an author whom we had liked and who had published successfully and whom we had encouraged to do a book on this subject. So there was no doubt on anybody's mind about our taking it on.
The whole thing is so explosive, and the pressure on the other side so powerful and so enormous that I feel it far wiser to keep my...
Carson would be attacking a powerful, well-organized industry. Her case would have to be airtight. Persuaded by the evidence that she had uncovered, she set out on a crusade. Late in 1958, she wrote to Paul Brooks.
Broad conceptions will reveal the futility and the basic wrongness of the present chemical program even better than ranting against it, though I shall rant a little too.
She had to absorb an overwhelming amount of data. She was working alone and desperately needed help. She wrote to Brooks with good news about a new assistant.
She wasn't anywhere near ready. She felt very bogged down by these masses of materials and trying to keep track of them. And
many people in universities or government agencies or even industry who were on her side were very helpful, but they had to do it extremely carefully. This man later said he thought the most useful thing he'd done in his whole career was slip stuff to Rachel Carson when she was writing the book.
Carson was outraged to discover within the government a pervasive attitude of secretiveness and denial. One field worker wrote, "The USDA representatives have consistently downgraded the biologist's findings on damage to fish and wildlife. They have refused to give me information, saying no significant wildlife damage occurs." John George found the Department of Agriculture reluctant to publish methods of safe pesticide disposal.
Well, the administrators didn't want to bring out any information along these lines because it might leave the impression that pesticides were dangerous if you've got to be careful at how you got rid of them.
I was up against industry and agricultural experiment station personnel who insisted that the way they used these chemicals, they did no harm, and that the people who insisted otherwise were either misled or were being paranoid.
Some people she quoted in the book lost their jobs very quickly. You didn't speak up against the establishment on this, even for such innocent things as saying, no, we do better with Dutch elm disease if we don't spray the trees, we just clean them up. That man lost his job.
Carson attacked what she saw as a heavy-handed, public-be-damned attitude behind certain government programs.
There was a mindset against insects. They really focused on the bad ones without realizing, I expect, ecologically, the vast majority of control of insects is by other insects. And you see, the moment you step in and play God with a chemical, you can get into some real problems. You just can't eradicate an insect with a chemical. I think you've got to be a little more imaginative than that.
They sprayed truck gardens and dairy farms, fish ponds and salt marshes, showering insecticide over children at play. A quarter horse drank from a trough in a field which the planes had sprayed. 10 hours later, it was dead.
See, all the big programs prior to that were largely federal lands. This was a big federal program that began to treat private lands, including farmlands. And all of a sudden, the milk was contaminated and the farmers couldn't sell their milk. And people were worried about their wildlife. It just led to a clamor.
Carson attacked the government for exaggerating the threat of insects like the fire ant.
During most of the 40-odd years since its arrival in the United States, the fire ant seems to have attracted little attention. With the development of chemicals of broad lethal powers, there came a sudden change in the official attitude toward the fire ant.
Human beings have lived with and have battled insects for many centuries. Now the war is between man and the imported fire ant.
Fire ant mounds could interfere with farm machinery, but the insect itself was only a nuisance. The government, however, insisted it was a serious menace in need of eradication.
This was a favorite word, eradication. And Congress bought this, you know, because, boy, if you eradicate a thing, you'd never have to worry about it again.
Dieldrin was one of the most effective pesticides, but it was 40 times more toxic than DDT. Even so, millions of pounds of Dieldrin were spread in the Deep South by the Department of Agriculture.
Urgent protests were made. The protests were ignored. 1 million acres were treated the first year. The Agriculture Department brushed away all evidence of damage as exaggerated and misleading.
I'm out in the field in Georgia with a control entomologist, and Dieldrin was 3 inches thick on this meadow. Horses, cattle, sheep, mules, roosters, cats, dogs, everything had died in that particular area. And this person is saying, no effect.
One colleague wrote to her, "You are rendering a tremendous public service, yet I warn you that you are going to be subjected to ridicule and condemnation. Facts will not stand in the way of some confirmed pest control workers."
They also made a similar threat to the New Yorker on the basis of the 3 sections that the New Yorker had already published. And we in the New Yorker both told them that the facts had been checked and that we were going to go ahead.
The Secretary Udall of Interior at the time, he was impressed by it. And I got the pleasant message from the Secretary, would I document every statement that she had made? And of course, I could have done that, but I was able to wiggle out of it by saying, Mr. Secretary, she's going to publish a book and everything will be documented in the book.
There were people, scientists in my department, concerned about DDT and pesticides, but I can assure you, when I became Secretary of Interior, their voices were in the background and they didn't have the attention of policymakers.
But the subject of pesticide overuse came up at an August news conference held by President Kennedy.
Have you considered asking the Department of Agriculture or the Public Health Service to take a closer look at this?
Yes, and I know that they already are. I think particularly, of course, since Ms. Carson's book, but they are examining the matter.
The New Yorker excerpts had primed the public. When the book was published on September 14th, the Consumer Union had already ordered 60,000 copies. Within 2 weeks, it was a bestseller.
I remember a conversation with President Kennedy where he brought the subject up, and you know, he had a very quick mind, but getting it into the consciousness of the president, getting action in the White House was very important. I had the good sense to take the advice of my people and champion Rachel almost from the beginning, because we saw that that was our mission and that she was in effect giving us a new charge. But the chemical people, the chemical industry, the agribusiness people, they began speaking up, and you had in effect a pitched battle.
Any possible angle was going to be used to discredit her. She was a hysterical woman. She was a bird lover or something.
They tried to clobber her, beat her down with the weight of their opinions, and some of them were distinguished men.
It was attacked by the American Medical Association. It was attacked by Monsanto, who said, in effect, that we were turning the world over to the insects. But the lowest of all was when she talked about the effect of all this on future generations.
Some of the harshest attacks on Carson came from industry scientists such as Dr. Robert White Stevens of American Cyanamid.
The major claims in Miss Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, are gross distortions of the actual facts, completely unsupported by scientific experimental evidence and general practical experience in the field. The real threat, then, to the survival of man is not chemical, but biological, in the shape of hordes of insects that can denude our forests, sweep over our croplands.
He was a very eloquent person, a great speaker, and he did most of the talking, I did most of the writing, I guess.
Now, although there are a number of scientific errors, misquotations, and obvious misinterpretations in her book, it must be admitted that much of her material is, in part at least, scientifically accurate. The area of disagreement between Miss Carson and students of applied agricultural chemistry, however, will lie in her clearly misplaced emphasis.
When she turned to Silent Spring, she became very vindictive and very inaccurate and very selective in what she presented. And it was that I took issue with. One of the bad things about the book was it made people terrified of pesticide residues in foods. And that stays with us to this day, even though the residues are not even present. There is a great value to bringing in the public into these debates, but the public have to be supplied with authentic information. And we felt that Silent Spring had not done that.
This is the kind of tug of war that we are exposed to in the beginning of a public controversy. And nobody knows the real answer. Everybody stakes out a claim, and we argue it the best we can.
As far as Rachel was concerned, I don't think there was another side of the story. I think she was, so convinced that we were destroying the earth with the careless use of pesticides that there was no room for doubt.
Sales soared. The book went into second and third printings. It was a Book of the Month Club selection. Before the end of the year, Robert White Stevens had given 28 speeches, and pesticide bills were introduced in 40 state legislatures.
I was probably 11 when Silent Spring was actually published, so things were very black and white to me. Rachel was the good guy, and anybody that was attacking her was were the black hats. We collected all the cartoons, the editorial cartoons and that sort of thing. And there was a whole lot of commotion. The CBS people came and did an interview at our house in Maryland.
Carson was weak from continuous radiation therapy. She made few public appearances, but agreed to be in a CBS report about the controversy. The program's producer was Jay McMullen.
About 2 weeks before the broadcast, the network came out with its publicity about what was the broadcast all about and who was going to be on it and all of that. Two very interesting things happened. We got more than 1,000 letters, which was an astonishing amount of mail. Never had that much mail before a broadcast went on the air. First of all, they're all mimeographed. They all said the same thing. In essence, look, be fair about this issue. I thought they were from the chemical industry, but I could be dead wrong about that. Now, the second thing that happened was that the two major sponsors of the program pulled out. They said the program was not the kind of showplace they wanted for their product. I imagine that most of the public, and certainly most of our audience for the Silent Spring of Rachel Carson, had never seen or heard Rachel Carson speak before.
We've heard the benefits of pesticides. We have heard a great deal about their safety, but very little about the hazards, very little about the failures, the inefficiencies. And yet the public was being asked to accept these chemicals, was being asked to acquiesce in their use. and did not have the whole picture. So I set about to remedy the balance there.
Dr. Robert White Stevens was eloquent all the way through. He was never at a loss for words. He wasn't embarrassed for his industry.
The crux, the fulcrum over which the argument chiefly rests is that Miss Carson maintains that the balance of nature is a major force in the survival of man, whereas the modern chemist, the modern biologist, the modern scientist believes that man is steadily controlling nature.
Now, to these people, apparently the balance of nature was something that was repealed as soon as man came on the scene. Well, you might just as well assume that you could repeal the law of gravity. The balance of nature is built of a series of interrelationships between living things and between living things and their environment.
The day following the broadcast, Senator Abraham Ribicoff of Connecticut announced that the Senate would hold hearings on pesticide use.
If it weren't for Rachel Carson, I never would have had these hearings. I was not aware of the extent and the importance of the problem she raised. It became important that this was an area the government had a responsibility of determining what to do about it, because no one else was going to do it.
Carson knew that the only way to bring about lasting change was to encourage government to take a leadership role.
First, I hope this committee will give serious consideration to a much neglected problem, that of the right of the citizen to be secure in his own home against the intrusion of poisons applied by other persons. I speak not as a lawyer, but as a biologist and as a human being. But I strongly feel that this is or should be one of the basic human rights.
I've always known, philosophically, that one who believes is a majority because most people don't believe in anything. And here was a person that really believed and was right. See, what people don't understand is that Rachel Carson wasn't for the complete outlawing of pesticides or chemicals to help agriculture. Her point of view was that it was over-abused, that it wasn't used properly, it wasn't under control.
During these hearings, the President's Science Advisory Committee released its report. It vindicated Carson's warning and ended with this conclusion. Until the publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, people were generally unaware of the toxicity of pesticides. But Silent Spring transcended the pesticide issue and forced people to think about the environment in a new way.
The thing that was predominant and up front when I became Secretary of Interior was the emergence of the atomic age, of the atom changing our lives, of the conquest of nature, of technology as being the great thing that was going to change the world and change our lives. And the natural world was pushed into the background. I think Rachel Carson brought it out of the dark corner and put it up front and challenged all of us to say, well, can you really ignore nature? If you think of her as a revolutionary, it's rather startling. But in the sense of a change in our thought, I think she was a revolutionary.